Welcome to this episode of Preaching the Word, a video series on preaching sponsored by the Dunk Tank and the Berman Ministry Center. My name is Dr. Stephen Reasor, and I'm a preacher and author, and I teach preaching at Berman University in Lacombe, Alberta. In this episode, we look at the final sermon shape of this series, preaching a metaphor. There are many places in Scripture where metaphors are used to convey meaning. A metaphor enables us to see one thing in terms of another. The metaphorical sermon structure builds upon this experience by creating three different moments in the sermon. In Move 1, we experience the metaphorical world, like the world of shepherding, or the world of auto mechanics, or the world of gardening. In the second move, we work to open the eyes of the faith to see the works of God in terms of that metaphorical world. So we could say Jesus is the good shepherd, or God is the mechanic, or God is the patient gardener. And finally, 3, we see the world anew as one looks at life through the eyes of faith, now shaped by that metaphorical world. For example, God's people listen to the voice of their good shepherd. Or the mechanic can change out the heart of the car. Or the gardener does not abandon the garden as he waits for it to grow. In the first move of the sermon, the preacher describes the metaphorical world, including details that create that world in the imagination of the hearers, and also to prepare the hearers for a later discovery in light of the chosen metaphor. In the second move, the preacher presents the claim of the text upon the theology or beliefs of the hearer through the lens of the metaphor. So ideally, the metaphor should be illustrative of the claim of the text in some way, so that the metaphor brings the congregation into a deeper understanding of how the text relates to their faith. In the third move, the preacher applies the metaphor to create a new vision for the congregation's life and practice of their faith. Although the congregation is familiar with the text and the teachings of their faith, the metaphor helps them to discover things that they haven't seen before. As an example, for these 3 moves, if I'm going to write a sermon on faith from Luke 17, and I want to use a metaphorical form, it might have the following moves. Move 1 is the metaphor world. This would be the metaphorical world of the master, or the boss, and his servant or employee. Move number 2 would be God's work in the metaphor. And it would look like something like the boss looks after the well-being of all and has the full picture of the needs for the company. And finally, the third move would be a new vision of our world based on that metaphor. And that move statement would say something like, doing what God expects of us is the bare minimum of faith. So this type of sermon works best when a metaphor is used in the text in support of the central teaching of the text. Fortunately, Luke 17 has a metaphor, the metaphor of a master and servant to use. Your assignment for this episode is to choose a portion of Scripture that you would like to preach on that has an embedded metaphor. Now, many of Jesus' parables use metaphor, as do the Old Testament prophets. Consider how you can shape a metaphor sermon from the text. Write out the 3 move statements as I have just outlined. And when you have finished your assignment, join me for the next episode of this series on sermon forms. We won't be looking at a new sermon form. Instead, we will talk about illustrations. What are they? How they can work? And where to find them. See you then.